Welcome if you've come to listen again to this 8th talk on the nature of the Reformation in the 16th century. Having looked at the Reformation in Germany under Luther, we're now going to return to follow the progress of the Reformation in Switzerland. We had previously looked at the birth of the Reformation in the city of Zurich under Zwingli, and now we're going to see how it spread to other major cities and regions in the west of Switzerland, which is mainly French-speaking, which will include the city of Geneva, where the reformer John Calvin was to lead the church. It would just be good to remind ourselves that at this time, the Swiss regions or cantons had formed themselves into a confederation which had its own autonomy, independence within the Holy Roman Empire. This is a crucial factor, as I have said, in that it gave the Swiss regions the freedom to choose which religion to follow without the threat of military action from the Pope or from the Emperor. So the next significant city to adopt the Reformation was Bern, which is the capital city of Switzerland today and which was a major center of influence in its own day. As in Zurich in the early 1520s, the Reformation had its followers in Bern who applied pressure for change. However, it would take a number of years for the city council to turn Bern completely to the Reformed faith. Basically, there were three Reformed ministers who were propagating the Reformed doctrine in Bern. And in addition to them, there was also a gifted layman, Nicolaus Manuel, who was quite famous. He created anti-Catholic satirical dramas in the streets. In his outdoor plays, he mercilessly mocked the papacy and the obvious immoral and self-indulgent lifestyles of the Catholic clergy. His plays were very popular and drew large crowds. So by this very public exposure of Catholic abuses, a foundation of anti-Catholic feeling was already being laid among the citizens of Bern, as well as from the teachings of the reformers. As a consequence of the growing voice in favor of the Reformation, the city council, who are always decisive, of Bern, made some changes to religious practices as a concession to pressure from the Reform movement. In 1525, Bern abolished indulgences, seized some land from the Catholic Church, and removed certain clerical privileges. As well as that, the Catholic faithful were no longer forced to go on pilgrimages, confess, or to believe in purgatory. However, it was not all plain sailing for the reformers. They had to deal with backlashes, not only against their teachings, but against themselves as well, with one of the more well-known reformers called Haller wanting to quit at one stage, and he had to be encouraged by his fellow colleagues to continue. Moreover, due to the Peasants' War in Germany, if you remember that, which caused some alarm throughout Europe, the Reformed movement stalled for a while and even suffered a reversal in Bern, with the council reversing earlier decisions it had made in favor of the Protestant reformers. Now, we can see from these series of events that the so-called success of the Reformation in Bern would not depend on multitudes responding to the gospel and being converted through gospel preaching, but by winning the religious seesaw debates that were going on in the city councils of Bern. And this happened eventually in 1528. What happened was that the Reformed group steadily gained strength, and by 1527, there was no revival. It just obtained a majority in the two governing councils of the city. And as was the custom, this led to a demand from them for a public disputation to decide which form of religion Bern should follow. So a disputation was held in January of that year. 250 theologians gathered, with Zurich sending about 100 ministers and laymen. The reformers were far better prepared than the Catholics, who weren't used to this kind of thing. And the reformers had some notable figures, such as Zwingli himself. So in the end, by a majority vote in its favor, the civic authorities of Bern ruled that the Reformation faith would be adopted, not to say imposed, on all churches in Bern and under Bern's jurisdiction. So the new Reformed order of service was bindingly introduced on all pastors. And the Bernese Council ordered the abolition of the Mass and declared that the Catholic bishop no longer had authority in Bern. Following these decisions, anti-Catholic feeling led to violent mob-led iconoclasm. And if you remember, iconoclasm is the violent physical destruction of symbols of the Catholic faith. The Catholic clerics and Catholic believers could not practice or give expression to their religion anymore in Bern. As in other places, the city of Bern converted to the Reformed religion, not by people being converted by the gospel, but by a vote of the city council, which then imposed its religion on everyone within its jurisdiction. We must also realize that that political considerations played a part in the council's decision as well as religious ones. A vote for the Reformation was for some simply a vote against Catholic rule and exploitation. As it had been from the days of the Emperor Constantine, so it is here. The secular power oversees a so-called disputation between Christian factions. However, in Switzerland, it was not an emperor or a prince or Catholic clerics that held the power, but the magistrates, the city councils. And it is they who needed persuading, because it is they who would decide which form of religion would be imposed on all its citizens. And it was by this process of persuading the city and town councils that the Reformation took hold in Switzerland. As one writer on the Swiss Reformation states, quote, "This was a top-down Reformation. Bern did not negotiate matters of religion with its population once its council had decided to adopt the new faith. Some on the council and many in the countryside supported Roman Catholicism, with one region rising up in protest. Nevertheless, the city would not accept religious pluralism within its territory. As it was from the days of Constantine, so it was under the reformers themselves." The reformers had the same mindset and outlook as the Roman Catholics had for over 1,000 years. That is, they allowed no toleration of any other form of Christianity in their regions, but imposed their own dogma and persecuted, mostly mercilessly, all dissenters. Next, Bern applied these decisions to the regions under its jurisdictions, with the council turning its attention to enforcing the Reformation in the rural parishes, many of which were located close to Catholic territory and which were reluctant to adopt the changes. Bern did allow the men of each parish to vote for the creed that they wished to prevail in their village or local church. However, once the vote went in favor of the Reformed camp, the churches would immediately be purged of Catholic symbols and the Mass banned completely in that area. Again, it was a change by vote, not through conversions by means of the preaching of the gospel. But changing people's religion by a vote in the council was not going to carry everyone with it, to say the least. So in the autumn of that same year, 1528, war broke out between now Protestant Bern and some villages in the Bernese highlands, where people were protesting against the enforced changes. Nearly 1,000 peasants from the highlands massed together to march on the capital Bern. However, by military force and the use of firearms, reformed Protestant Bern put down the rebellion of the Catholic villagers, thus imposing the Protestant religion on the very rural and alpine villages under its jurisdiction, which were still, you can imagine, in these remote areas, they were still deeply traditionally Catholic. But they had to change by the twisting of their arm. And ultimately, Bern would do this right across the French-speaking regions of Western Switzerland. I suppose it would be good to remind ourselves of one of the main factors that helped bring in the Reformation, which I have just already mentioned, but it was the state of the Catholic Church and its clerics. They imposed financial burdens on people, abused their power, exploited people's ignorance, lived in luxury and in immoral lifestyles while people suffered. And many of the clerics lived totally self-indulgent, immoral lives, whereby they also manifestly neglected to care for their flocks. So we can see that the Catholic Church was an easy target for the mockery of satirical dramas in the streets of Bern, and the anti-Catholic campaign of the Reformers found a ready audience among its listeners. But we must not confuse this adoption of the Reformed religion with personal conversion brought about by the gospel. In all the biographies and histories of the Reformation that I have read so far, it is nowhere recorded that through the teaching of the Reformers, communities were changed by a conviction of personal sin and the consequent personal repentance of the citizens, leading to radically changed lives. There is only records of this type of conversions among the Anabaptists. As we have seen, the mandate requiring Bern to adopt the Reformation led to violent destruction of images and statues in the Catholic churches. This is hardly a sign of people being freshly and genuinely converted and rejoicing in Christ their Savior. It is more akin to religious fanaticism of the still Christianized, unconverted community. This is the kind of thing one sees in populist or political or revolutionary movements, not in revivals. Nevertheless, because of its importance, Bern converting to the Reformation was a crucial and decisive factor in its spread, in the spread of the Reformation into the other French-speaking regions of Switzerland, which included what's called Vaud or Pays de Vaud, and the important cities of Neuchatel, Lausanne, and Geneva. But before we look at that, we will just briefly look at what happened in the important city of Bâle, or today it's also pronounced Basel, just north of Bern. And what took place in Basel was very similar to what happened in Bern, except that there was more violence involved in the thrusting out of Catholicism. Things had been progressing by slow degrees also in Basel in the 1520s. Zwingli's friend, John Lampedius, was leading the cause of the Reformation in Basel, and he was having significant influence in the city. However, the town council avoided taking sides in the growing conflict between the Reformed camp and the Catholic camp. Eventually, the people grew impatient with the council's slowness to accept reform. On Good Friday, 1528, iconoclasm started with images being thrown out of St. Martin's Church, where Lampedius had been preaching. After this, the triumph of the Reformation in Bern in 1528 gave the final impetus to the overthrow by force of Catholicism in Basel. The city council was still hesitating to adopt Reformed teaching. So on the 9th of February, 1529, a revolution or violent riot broke out. The Protestant citizens, numbering several hundred, came together and went on a rampage of the churches. They broke to pieces the images and crucifixes, removed pictures from the churches, and compelled the council, with force of weapons, to adopt the Reformed religion. I would say that this is not the mark of spiritual revival or the fruit of a people who have just been converted by the gospel. Nevertheless, certain Protestant historians in their writings hail the success of the Reformation in these cities. Now, Erasmus, he was in Basel at this time, and he was an advocate for patience and moderation. And he wanted change to take place within the context of the Catholic Church, not to create a new church. And he described how all over the place images and the like were destroyed, pulverized, smashed, and burned. And this is what he wrote. They heaped such insults on the images of the saints and the crucifix itself that it is quite surprising that there was no miracle. Not a statue was left. The frescoes were obliterated by means of coating of lime. Whatever would burn was thrown into the fire, and the rest pounded into fragments. Nothing was spared for either love or money. Erasmus couldn't identify with this populist uprising and the use of such violence, and so he left Basel. Again, I would say this is strange fruit, strange behavior from those who it is claimed they have been converted to an evangelical faith. Again, I would say this is not the fruit of the preaching of the evangelical gospel. It is just religious fanaticism. This aggressive iconoclasm of Basel stands out from others by the extent of its violence, so others write. And one author who wrote a book about Reformation iconoclasm in Swiss cities, he says that it is not easy at all to account for this riotous violence of those called evangelicals. That's what he says. However, for me, such behavior would be completely consistent with the view expressed in these talks. It would be totally consistent with a purely Christianized, not converted, Christianized community who simply cast off one form of Christian dogma, namely Catholicism, and adopted a different form of Christian dogma called Reformed. However, in the whole process, the community remains fundamentally Christianized, not converted. Therefore, it would be totally consistent to behave as the world does, namely to behave as the unconverted, religious though they be. They have a form of zealous religion, but know nothing of the gospel's life-changing power. The Protestant reformers themselves belonged to the culture and world of Christianization, of the state church and its sole dominance. They never left it. They never got out of it. They were part of it. They brought a teaching that changed people's religious allegiance, but they didn't preach a gospel that changed people's hearts. Moreover, the changes brought about by the Reformed Council in Basel did not eliminate Catholic traditions completely. The Protestant church historian Philip Schaff writes that, quote, on the 1st of April 1529, an order of liturgical service and church discipline was published by the council, which gave a solid foundation to the Reformed Church of the city of Basel and the surrounding villages. However, it retains a number of Catholic customs, such as daily morning and evening worship, weekly communion in one of the city churches, the observance of the great festivals, including those of the Virgin Mary, the apostles, and the saints. One of the features of the Swiss Reformation was that it was the civil authorities who would determine doctrine and practice, and the Reformation preachers had to submit to them in order to survive. As I had said, the events in Bern had a decisive effect on the spread of the Reformation, not to say the imposition of the Reformation on the French-speaking regions of Switzerland to the southwest of Bern. This area encompasses the region known as the Pays de Vaud. And the cities, as I've said, Neuchatel, Lausanne, and Geneva. Geneva is, of course, the city where John Calvin was active for many years as chief pastor. And it is significant to see in what context Geneva adopted the Reformed faith. The history of this French-speaking region is somewhat complex, so I'll try to keep to the basics that are relevant to our study. The first thing to say is that this region was generally strongly and deeply Catholic, particularly in the more rural and mountainous regions. However, it was also an area that had sought independence from the neighboring Catholic, Duchy of Savoy. This was a crucial, decisive factor in these regions going over to the Reformed religion. There was mounting tension and conflict between the Duchy of Savoy and its Duke and the French-speaking region of Western Switzerland. That had been going on for a number of years. As a result of this, to guard against domination by the Duchy of Savoy, in 1519, Geneva and Lausanne signed treaties of mutual assistance with Bern, along with the Catholic city of Fribourg, because at this time, the context wasn't religious at all. It was totally political. The treaties and this link to Bern preceded the tensions that arose later on regarding the Reformation and did not have a religious aspect to them. The treaty stipulated that Bern and Fribourg which would protect Lausanne and Geneva from outside attack. In 1526, Bern, Fribourg, and Geneva renewed their alliance, which was entirely political in nature, and made in order to secure Geneva's independence. The neighboring Duke of Savoy, against whom these treaties were targeted, did not take kindly to this alliance and created an economic blockade of Geneva. Eventually, this brought Bern into the conflict, and Bern's army marched across the Pays de Vaud region and liberated, as it were, Geneva in 1530, in which year another treaty was signed between them and with the Duke of Savoy. What is of importance here is that the French-speaking region was deeply Catholic. In the 1520s, it actually passed measures to outlaw Reformed and Lutheran teachings in its regions. However, it was also jealous of its own independence from the Duchy of Savoy and from the associated Catholic bishops. But the French-speaking regions were now reliant on Protestant Bern, as it had become, for their independence, and Bern overrode its attempt to ban Protestant teaching in its French-speaking cities and regions. So what was happening is that religion got enmeshed with the politics of this situation. Bern's guarantee of security, in effect, started to become conditional on the French-speaking territories allowing Reformed preaching within its areas, including Geneva and Lausanne. Eventually, Bern went further by applying such pressure so as to ensure that the Reformed doctrine would be accepted as the religion in these territories. It would take a number of years, but that is what happened. Moreover, as we have previously seen, the other factor that allowed the Reformation inroads into these areas was the conduct and lifestyles of the Catholic clerics. So how did the Reformation spread in the Pays de Vaud, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland? The person we now have to introduce is a person called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly in French, Guillaume Farel. In English, William. I'll call him William. William Farel. He is well known as the reformer who introduced Calvin to Geneva. But he was also an extremely significant figure in spreading the Reformation in these French-speaking regions. Farel had been engaged by the Bernese authorities to spread the Reformed faith in the French territories under their control. Like so many other reformers, if not all other reformers, Farel was a keen student of the famous Jacques Lefebvre, the Catholic Renaissance humanist. How was Farel able to teach the Reformed faith in these deeply Catholic regions of Western Switzerland? Well, the one factor that stopped him being thrown out of these regions very early on was because Bern had overruling authority in these regions as defender of their independence. Bern had issued mandates in favor of the Reformation to dampen unrest in Bern itself between the Protestant Catholics, but they were also applied within the French-speaking regions. And they enabled Reformed preachers like Farel to preach legally in Catholic pulpits, despite the violent protests against him. Farel was a fiery, confrontational, and charismatic figure who was advised and warned even by his own co-reformers to moderate both his language and behavior. In the town of Montbéliard, Farel came across a procession on the day of the feast of St. Anthony. Very angered by this superstitious rite, he boldly advances and rebukes the people for their idolatry. Then he suddenly seizes the image of their saints from the arms of the priests and tosses it over the bridge into the river below. While the procession stood stunned and horrified at such sacrilege, he made his quick escape before they could grab him and throw him into the water. This incident highlights how the focus of the reformers' preaching and action was more anti-Catholic and Old Testament in character than evangelical. Farel had a very turbulent time in these French-speaking regions. He went to towns and villages where he would preach either in the open air in churches. He would even interrupt Catholic church services, climb the pulpit, take over the service and start preaching against Catholic abuses, idolatry, and superstitions in the most vehement style. He would spend longer or shorter times there depending on his reception. He was often met with violent reactions from among the Catholics who would rush upon him, beat him and club him. He suffered quite a few bad injuries during these years, and at times his life was in danger. But in everything that I have read, this violent reaction to him was in response to his very vehement anti-Catholic onslaught, verbal onslaught. It wasn't a violent reaction against him preaching a gospel of personal salvation, which I find no record of. Now, so the local Catholic authorities would complain to Bern about Farel's activities, but each time the citizens of these regions were reminded that the area was under Bern's supervision and mandate, and that Farel was not to be hindered in his preaching. In other words, to a very great extent, Farel had been foisted on Catholic communities by the authority of Bern. In some cases, the locals refused to attend the Protestant preaching and went to Mass in a nearby Catholic village. Those who opposed openly could find themselves before the court. When Farel was met with resistance, Bern would send officials to ensure that he was listened to in an orderly fashion. Nevertheless, when they could, parts of the Catholic community would cause him to abandon his preaching in churches by shouting and yelling him down, by ringing the church bells, or by beating drums outside, all of which they did in various places. It was confusion and chaos. Bruce Gordon, professor of ecclesiastical history, a modern historian, in his biography on Calvin, writes the following regarding Farel. His inflammatory sermons were badly received, and he was forced to move from one community to another, often with haste. His greatest triumph came in the city of Neuchatel in the autumn of 1530, following a campaign of preaching in which he poured forth his invective against the Catholic Mass and the priests. In 1530, he posted placards in Neuchatel denouncing those who celebrated the Mass as villains, murderers, thieves, renouncers of Jesus Christ, and seducers of the people, quote unquote. The assault on the Mass was the focus of Farel's campaign. Gordon goes on to say, churches were to be purged of idolatrous worship. In the autumn of 1530, a frenzied crowd carried Farel into the cathedral in Neuchatel, where he denounced the abomination of images. Stirred by his castigations, the crowd turned on the saints' altars and vestments in a fury of destruction. The force of the crowd violence pushed the Reformation to a vote in the city, and by a slim majority, the new faith carried the day. Farel had made Neuchatel the first French-speaking city of the Reformation, unquote. In the midst of this tumult, just to backtrack what happened in Neuchatel, the crowd responds to Farel's verbal onslaught against Catholicism by vowing the following. This is what they say when they were stirred in the cathedral. We will follow the evangelical religion, both we and our children, and in it we will live and die, unquote. The quote from the biographer above and from the vow of the crowd bear out what I have been saying about the nature of the Reformation as a religious phenomenon and not a spiritual one. Farel, with the legal and military force of Bern behind him, gets a crowd to support him in physically overthrowing Catholicism in the city of Neuchatel. The people are not bowed and moved to tears because of a conviction of their personal sins through the preaching of the gospel. Not at all. They are stirred up into a violent anti-Catholic mob to abandon one form of dead religion simply to adopt another, for which they say they are ready to die for. Having now pledged their lives and allegiance, let it be noticed, not to Christ, but to the Reformed faith, Farel's supporters go on a cleansing rampage of the cathedral, seizing mattocks and hatchets and hammers. The new evangelical converts, so-called, smash statues, crucifixes, rip the eyes out of images and paintings, and all the broken fragments are thrown from the top of the rock of the cathedral in Neuchatel into the torrent of the river below. Things even came to blows between the Catholics and the Protestants in the cathedral before order was restored. The preaching of the reformers induced a change of religion, but not a change of heart. The historian Bruce Gordon continues by saying, Farel's activities enjoyed the protection of Bern and its considerable military force. The Bernese encouraged his campaign of violence by turning a blind eye to destructive and illegal acts. Farel and his fellow ministers engaged in covert acts of iconoclasm in which Catholic churches were attacked, often in the dead of night, and images desecrated. In the French-speaking lands, it was a pitched battle between a small but fanatical number of reformers and a resolutely Catholic population, largely resistant to their charms. One could go on to look at some of the other towns and villages where this kind of thing took place, but time doesn't allow, and I think we've had sufficient flavor of what was going on. Suffice it to say that Farel made preaching forays into a number of French-speaking communities, many of which quickly drove him out, often with violence. However, Bern ordered that these communities allow Farel to preach freely among them. Nevertheless, success was very limited. Again, Bruce Gordon notes that, quote, from the perspective of the reformers in Bern, the situation in the Pays de Vaud was dismal. Only 12 of the 154 parishes in the region showed any trace of evangelical activity, unquote. However, things would change when Bern was given the opportunity to again invade the French-speaking regions of the Pays de Vaud in western Switzerland. Despite the peace treaty that had been agreed in 1530, I believe, as I mentioned, the Duke of Savoy was now troubling Geneva again. And after the Duke refused to negotiate peacefully, Bern took this opportunity. Bern's armies invaded now the Pays de Vaud in January 1536 to secure this region from the Duke, and it easily overcame the little resistance that was there. Pardon me. The allegiance of this whole region, with its cities, towns, and villages, had now to switch to Bern, and the French-speaking region of the Pays de Vaud, which included Lausanne, came under the jurisdiction of Protestant Bern, and including Geneva. To all intents and purposes, these regions of Western Switzerland had become the possession of Bern. Although Bern promised that no locality would be forced to adopt the Reformed faith, the reluctance and resistance of the people to the new religion was such that eventually Bern twisted their arm to make them accept the Protestant faith in their towns and cities. After its military conquest of the Vaud in 1536, the Bernese focused their attention to win over the city of Lausanne to the Reformation. Lausanne was an important administrative center in the region and would be useful in imposing the Reformed religion on the surrounding areas if it could be won over. Again, Bruce Gordon writes, the imposition of the Reformed faith began in the summer of 1536. To provide a sense of legitimacy, the Bernese magistrates employed a tactic often used in the Swiss Reformation. They summoned a disputation. And I'll just interrupt his quote here. If you've been listening to the talks, you will be familiar with this. What began under Constantine certainly continued under within the 16th century Reformation. The reformers won things through by a disputation. They summoned a disputation. It was to be held in Lausanne in October, and 10 points of Reformed teaching provided the basis of the debate. This was not an open exchange of views, writes Bruce Gordon. The outcome was already determined, as the Bernese authorities intended to persuade the reluctant Vaudois to accept the new faith. The foregone conclusion was declared. The Mass was to be abolished in the Vaud, and by the 19th of October, a first Reformation edict required the removal of altars, images, and liturgical instruments. Unquote. Now, Bruce Gordon is among several historians, Reformation historians, scholars, who make this same point, namely that the disputation within these public councils, or before in the councils, but they were public disputations, were simply a strategy, a vehicle that was employed which would ensure the acceptance or the imposition of the Reformed religion in a given city or territory. Unlike in Germany, where the Catholic Church was stronger and Luther was hauled before these diets where he was interrogated by a Catholic clergy with regards to what they called his heresy. The criterion was Catholic teaching and tradition. In Switzerland, it was totally different. There was no Catholic Church. It was the civil magistrates who were now deciding. And the debate wasn't in Latin, it was in the vernacular, in French. And it included the citizens of the area. And by the stipulation of Bern, the only criteria now were the scriptures. You couldn't go outside the scriptures. The Catholics had the rug taken from under their feet. They could not win the vote. The vote, as these historians say, was a foregone conclusion. And even one Catholic cleric admitted he can't answer certain things because it relates to Catholic tradition, not to the scripture. But it is generally recognized that the towns and villages of the Pays de Vaud were made to accept the Reformation under duress from Protestant Bern. However, despite the official imposition of the Reformed religion, in many places, people still continued with Catholic services and traditions. In general, the French-speaking regions valued being independent of the Duke of Savoy. They appreciated that, but they weren't keen on having a new religion forced down their throats, imposed upon them. Thus, the resentment, resistance, and tensions remained throughout the French-speaking regions. To finish this section and to prepare us for our consideration of Calvin's activity and rule in Geneva, we need to look at the background of how Reformed teaching gained its foothold and reign in the city of Geneva itself. Already before Farel arrived in Geneva, there were political factions there. As I'd already mentioned, there was a faction that tended towards Bern, had an affinity, wanted a stronger relationship with Bern, because in Bern they saw deliverance from Catholic Duchy of Savoy. In Bern lay their economic independence. But there was still in Geneva a strong Catholic faction that wanted to maintain a status quo. So there was already these two factions. And when Farel comes to Geneva, he finds some sympathizers because his Reformation preaching he is a representative of Bern, a representative of political independence. So the two get mixed up, at least to some extent, if not to a great extent. So in 1532, Farel comes to Geneva and finds a few sympathizers. But his coming causes a commotion, and he was ordered to leave by the city authorities. However, he produces his credentials from Bern, his pieces of paper. So the council now had second thoughts about how they should treat him. But in the meantime, nevertheless, at this time, Farel was hauled before the Genevan Catholic Episcopal Council, where he was verbally abused and insulted by Catholic clerics. His reaction was interesting. In his reply to the Catholics, he said, quote, "Elijah said to King Ahab, 'It is you, not I, who disturb Israel.' So I say, it is you and yours who trouble the world by your traditions, your human inventions, and your dissolute lives. Unquote. In these words again, we detect that Farel doesn't view the Genevan citizens as those who need salvation through the preaching of the gospel. For him, the Christianized community of Geneva are viewed as God's people who are being deceived by the idolatrous Catholics. Farel saw himself more in the role of an Old Testament prophet inveighing against the sins of God's people, not as a New Testament evangelist. As we have seen, it was a fundamental flaw in the thinking of virtually all the reformers, and it was a reflection of their own spiritual state and condition. However, returning to Geneva, the Catholic clerics created such a tumult against Farel that he was physically jostled, beaten, and bruised, and ordered to leave Geneva within 3 hours. Farel hurriedly got to a boat by the lake and crossed the lake to escape their fury. However, the next year, 1533, the Bernese authorities sent an official letter to Geneva saying, quote, "We are surprised that in your city the faith in Jesus Christ and those who seek it are so greatly molested. You will not suffer the word of God to be freely proclaimed, and you banish those who preach it," unquote, from Bern to Geneva. This put the Genevan civil authorities in a quandary, as they are caught between the protests of the Catholic camp together with the threatenings of the Duke of Savoy on the one hand at that time, and on the other by the pressure from Protestant Bern, who were the guardians of their independence. Nevertheless, the Catholics in Geneva continued to preach against the Protestant heresy in Geneva, with a Dominican scholar called Guy Furberty leading the attack with some vehemence against the reformers and their teachings. And on January the 1st, 1534, the bishop forbade all preaching without his permission. However, a deputation then comes from Bern, bringing Farel and 2 other reformers, and orders, no surprise here, they order a disputation where the reformers are to be heard and where Furberty is called to defend his attacks on what Bern calls the gospel, or to face imprisonment. William Maxwell Blackburn, in his Life of Farel, writes the following concerning what the Bernese wrote to the Genevan council. Quote, "You must arrest Furberty and bring him to trial for insulting us," said the Bernese, "and he must prove from scripture what he has declared or recant." Unquote. When the Genevan Council hesitated about this measure, Bern threatened to annul the treaty which gave Geneva its security. So the Genevans yielded to this pressure and let the Bernese summon Furberty to a debate with Farel. So a public disputation is held on the 29th of January 1534 in the presence of the great and small councils and the delegates of Bern. The disputation ends in a partial victory for Farel. Furberty is now ordered to publicly apologize and recant, which he refuses to do. So he is promptly imprisoned for 2 years. Here we can see that the so-called progress or success of the Reformation in Geneva in particular, and in French-speaking Switzerland in general, was determined by power politics, the power politics of Bern. It had nothing to do with large numbers or even any numbers of citizens being converted by the preaching of the gospel and their personal lives being changed. So now Farel continued to preach in private houses in Geneva. And then on March the 1st, when a monk Francis Cotelier attacked the Reformation, Farel ascended the pulpit to refute him. And this was his first public sermon in Geneva. But immediately there were protests. The bishop pronounced the ban over the city in April, and the Duke of Savoy threatened war. But again, Bern reminded Geneva where its interest really lay. And with the support and protection of Bern, Farel, with other close associates, pushed forward the cause of the Reformation. But this took place with a fair amount of violence. But even so, none of these events yet meant that the Reformation had taken hold on Geneva. It was a slow, tense, uphill process. It wasn't until the next year in May 1535 that the Mass was provisionally suspended in Geneva. And as we had noted, Bern had invaded and taken possession of this region in January 1536. And it was only in the spring of that same year that the Reformed faith was officially adopted by edict in Geneva. The Mass was forbidden, images and relics were removed from the churches. Under pressure, priests, monks, and nuns gradually left the city, some under duress and under miserable circumstances. And the Catholic bishop had to relocate his see to Annecy, an asylum prepared for him by the Duke of Savoy. Writing about Geneva itself, where Calvin would come, Bruce Gordon writes this: certainly not all within the city were won over to the new religion, and traditional Catholicism remained strong. As in the Vaud, Farel divided communities with his aggressive methods. From 1535, we have the following graphic account by Jean de Jussy from the convent of St. Clair in Geneva, where she writes the following in her short chronicle. Quote, on the feast of Magdalene, 22nd of July, when they were ringing solemnly for Mass in her church, and the whole parish and other good Christians in the town were gathered there to hear the Holy Mass in great piety, that miserable preacher Farel brought his whole congregation. They came into the church of the Blessed Magdalene to obstruct her feast. And when they got inside, they closed the church and stood at the door and forced people to hear that sermon. This greatly distressed and troubled everyone. The women cried out loudly, and the men made such a ruckus that they, the Reformed party, left the church despite their plans. All divine service was stopped. But after those dogs left, the Christian people came back to the church, and the priests said the Mass even more solemnly than ever and in great piety. Those dogs did the same thing at Vespers, and they took possession of that holy church and preached there every day afterwards. And then in the church of Saint Gervais, they did the same at the Dominican monastery on the feast of their father, St. Dominic, and they obstructed divine services in all the churches, unquote. I think it gives you a flavor of what was happening in the so-called Reformation in Switzerland. The historian Gordon writes, the Bernese were left in an awkward position of governing a region that had adopted the Reformation in name alone. The Reformed Party was a tiny faction facing a hostile population determined to maintain its Catholic faith. Their hopes clearly lay in the eventual restoration of the Catholic faith. If ever Calvin needed to be taught a lesson about the implications of a semi-reformed church full of people who conformed to religious practices in which they did not believe, the Wort provided it. The other church historian of the Reformation, Philip Schaff, sums up the state of things like this. The people were anxious to get rid of the rule of the Duke of Savoy and the bishop, but had no conception of evangelical religion and would not submit to discipline. They mistook freedom for license. They were in danger of falling into the opposite extreme of disorder and confusion. This was the state of things when Calvin arrived at Geneva in the summer of that 1536. Philip Schaff was a 19th century Swiss-born Protestant theologian and ecclesiastical historian who wrote an 8-volume history of the Christian Church. In his writings on the Reformation, he was generally supportive of the reformers and the Reformation they brought into Europe. So I find it quite significant when he himself writes that the Genevan citizens had, quote, no conception of evangelical religion after Geneva had adopted the Reformed religion. What a comment that is on the preaching of Farel and the reformers in that city. His statement is not only something I completely agree with, but as you will have gathered from these talks, it is something that I believe applies to the whole Reformation movement across Europe. I believe that in general, in all those cities, regions, and territories of Europe that had chosen to go Protestant through the protection and decision of the civil or princely authority, that none of the population in those territories had any real conception of the evangelical gospel, for the simple reason that the gospel of salvation from personal sin was not preached by the reformers, whatever their written theology may have contained in those days or in later years. So that brings us right up to the time of Calvin's entrance to the Reformation. And so that's a good time to finish this 8th talk. Thank you very much.